Okay, we are recording. And we did start this error, right, last Thursday with James Monroe, our fifth president. I think I shared with you that it was called the error of good feelings after Monroe had went on a tour of New England, and he was given a very warm reception by the New Englanders, even though he was another Virginian in the White House. And so a Boston newspaper declared it an error of good feelings where there was peace, partly because one of the political parties, the Federalists, slowly died out during Monroe's first presidency. There was a time of prosperity, and there's also, which included expansion, territorial expansion under Monroe's presidency. But the error, as far as being a complete error of good feelings and peace, it did not last long. The Panic of 1819 kind of busted that bubble. So there was still territorial expansion afterwards, but the error was a short-lived one as far as an error of good feelings. You'll recall that Monroe was from Virginia, like Jefferson and Madison, and he had the same outlook as far as what he felt like the nation should be. It should be more of a rural, agrarian type of culture with smaller villages and a lot of farmland, small farms. He was one of the most experienced men to be president. And even Jefferson and Madison said that there basically is not one more qualified than Monroe. He had served in his state as well as on the federal level and in several different areas. He appointed as his Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, and remember his name here as we continue to move forward today. But let's talk about this Panic of 1819 for a few moments. We had mentioned under Madison, after the War of 1812, there was an increase or an economic nationalism as well as a political nationalism, a judicial nationalism, that were all a part of this American system that Henry Clay had a vision for. Well, the economic nationalism was, had this little bump in it, the Panic of 1819. There was you can see there, a recession that began in 1819. Several of the factors, along with what the textbook mentioned that was on the quiz, was the the collapse of cotton prices. The reason the cotton prices collapsed was because of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. During that time where England was at war with France, and it affected many of the farmers in those countries of Europe. And that's why our cotton prices soared so much. Well, when the Napoleonic Wars came to an end, you can see here there was a recovery of European agriculture, so it caused the cotton prices to collapse. Another major reason for this panic was the smaller state banks failed, and they had a very poor credit policy that was a main contributor to this economic recession. They had printed a lot of paper money, and each state had their own paper currency, and so this caused issues. And even for a while, remember we talked about the establishment of the Second Bank of the United States, even they went along with some of the smaller banks' policies, but they soon switched to a more conservative credit policy, and it was harder for farmers and small businessmen to get loans, and that affected the economy. So there were several factors, home and abroad, that contributed to this panic. And Monroe and his administration didn't really address, they didn't make it a major issue. They took small actions. And this panic, which we would classify as greater than a recession, but not a full-blown crash, lasted until 1823. And keep in mind, as we talk about Andrew Jackson and his presidency on Thursday, that the Second Bank of the United States and some of their hiccups here at the beginning of their 20-year charter did not sit well with Andrew Jackson. He did not trust the Second Bank of the United States. So keep that in mind when we move to President Jackson on Thursday. Any questions on the Panic of 1819? All right, let's move on to the Missouri Compromise. Of 1820 and 1821. In 1819, when the financial panic hit, there were 11 free states here north of the Ohio River in the Mason-Dixon line. And those are these lime green states. And then 11 slave states south of the Ohio River in this Tennessee orange color. So you have a balance between the North and the South. And we've grown from 13 colonies now to 22 colonies in about a 40-year period. I'm sorry, not 40, but a 32-year period since we became a republic. In 1820, Missouri, I'm going to make this one just a little bit bigger. It'll let me. Missouri petitioned for statehood. They had, and here's Missouri, the orange color with the diagonal lines. They had reached the population requirement of 60,000 white males. And so that was the requirement to petition for statehood, and they did so. And they were the first state west of the Mississippi River. This was the boundary for the first 22 states. So they were the first state west of the Mississippi to apply for statehood. A representative from New York by the name of James Talmadge Jr. proposed a resolution that would ban any more slaves in Missouri. This resolution outraged Southern slave owners who had a slave trade in the western lands. So it was a money-making venture. And they were outraged because this would hurt the cash inflow. But they also worried that it would give the North an advantage in the balance of slave states and free states. Another Northeast congressman named Timothy Fuller agreed with Talmadge, but he made a speech that really concerned Southerners. And he addressed the morality of slavery, and basically declared that Congress had a moral duty to stop the spread of slavery. So the House, the lower chamber of the House, passed Talmadge's resolution, but the Senate rejected it. So Missouri is still out there in limbo. At the same time, or around the same time, Maine, up here, way in the Northeast, they also petitioned to be a state. At one time, that area was controlled by Massachusetts. And so this is where the compromise came in. The Senate decided to admit both states, Maine being a free state and Missouri being a slave state. And then there was an amendment to the Missouri Compromise by Senator Jesse Thomas of Illinois. The amendment said that the southern border of Missouri, this red line here, which was a 36 degree, 30-minute parallel, that would be the border, and everything north of that would, any slaves that came in on that unorganized territory of the Louisiana Purchase, they would be free states. The Arkansas Territory, which included present-day Arkansas and all of Oklahoma except the Panhandle, that would be allowed as territory that could become slave states. And Louisiana was already in. And so that resolution, that amendment to the Missouri Compromise was passed on March 2nd, 1820. So you can see how the land right now is divvied up, the Louisiana Territory. And you can see definitely, I'm sure the Southerners saw this, there wasn't going to be many more slave states added in this territory, but there was a great potential for many more free states. Now, another issue arose after the passing of the whole resolution on March 2nd, 1820. Missourians who were pro-slave, they wanted a provision in the Missouri Constitution that banned free African Americans as well as mulattoes. Mulattoes were mixed race people. So this is what they wanted in their Constitution, that free blacks were prohibited from coming into the state. Why would they want that? It would not be in slave owners' best interests to have plantations in Missouri with African Americans as their slaves, and their slaves are seeing free African Americans in the territory. So they did not want them to be able to come in, because it would be a possible catalyst for the slaves in Missouri to rebel. However, having this in their state constitution would violate the U.S. Constitution, because free African Americans were extended all of the rights of white Americans. So that would be a violation of the U.S. Constitution. Henry Clay from Kentucky, who was Speaker of the House, proposed a second Missouri Compromise. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state only if its legislature pledged never to deny free blacks their constitutional rights. Missouri accepted that, and they became the 24th state on August 10th, 1821. Maine being the 23rd state. And so you still have a 12-12 balance of free and slave states. The Missouri Compromise the Northerners felt like it was a great victory. But Southerners were not too happy with the compromise. They were very wary of where it could lead into the future. So here's how the nation was, how it looked with the Missouri Compromise. Your free states are up here, Mason-Dixon line and Ohio River, the dividing point, as well as the Mississippi River. Your slave territories or states, with Missouri being admitted, Maine being admitted as a free state. The 3630 parallel line, which was the dividing line. Everything north of there in the remaining Louisiana Territory, any states that were formed out of this territory could only be free states. And then the Arkansas Territory, if that was made into more than one state, that would be those would be slave states. Maybe Arkansas would become a state eventually in their mind. The Oklahoma Territory, the 5/6 of it, not including the Panhandle, was kind of considered a desert wasteland at the time. And then you had, this is Spanish territory, which included Texas, and then west of Oklahoma, and then kind of along the Rocky Mountains. Up here in the Northwest is the Oregon country. And we're going to talk about how that was owned jointly by Great Britain and the United States. So that's kind of a dissection of the territory around 1820. Questions on the Missouri Compromise? All right. Let me share with you some of the characteristics of the sections that were kind of carved out during this time period. In the North, and you have some of these already, predominantly it was industry oriented. Any farms in the North were smaller farms, and you had more urban, big city areas with having these urban areas were starting to form slums. Poor people were gathered together in these urban areas. Large immigrant populations were characteristic of the larger urban cities and areas, and they provided labor for the factories and the mills that were starting to dot the landscape in the North. And so as the North also was, all of the states were emancipated or free states, they had little need for slave labor. And when we say the North, we're talking primarily the Northeast. When we talk about the West, we're going to talk about these states that were added after the 13 colonies, after the founding of the Republic, which had 13 colonies. But they were also located in the northern part of the territory, but they were considered West. We might say this is the East and this is the North. You're going to find different descriptions, but three basic regions. The South was predominantly agricultural. They were very dependent on foreign trade, especially with the crop of cotton. There were other farm products as well, but cotton was king. They were more smaller city or village focused instead of big city. And slavery was not only very common in the South, but it was looked upon as necessary for their economic development. That's the paradox of the South. They have a labor-intensive, cash-making crop, which, as more and more white males get involved in the cotton production, and they're enjoying and experiencing the American dream, so to speak, where they are landowners and they are free to own land and cultivate crops and be their own, enjoy that freedom. The paradox is that that was being sustained by the enslavement of human beings, of African Americans. And it was John Calhoun, which you'll see in chapter 10 if you haven't read that far yet, or chapter 11, excuse me, who called slavery our peculiar institution. And then the section of the West, or possibly maybe the North, however you want to refer to it, it was more agriculturally oriented, but not as, not the big plantations like in the South. More farms than the Northeast. Ohio, Indiana, rich farmland, bigger farms than the Northeast. Not as industry driven as the Northeast. And also you had more adventurer type of people, explorers, Western people going west, pioneers looking for open land, looking for their own land. The innovations that we talked about in transportation were very important for the North or the West and helped transport people and goods. And also, as people are moving west, and this would be in both areas, north and south of the Ohio River in the 3630 line, they're pushing Native Americans out of their native lands, pushing them more to the west. We will see under Jackson's presidency the forced removal of Native Americans out of Florida and Alabama and Georgia, with the Trail of Tears bringing them to Oklahoma or the Indian Territory. So those are the differing characteristics of these sections around this time. Any questions on that? All right, it's 10:13. Let's take a break until 10:20, and we will pick up with the diplomacy, the foreign policy under President Monroe. So about a 6.5-minute break until 10:20. And we are back. All right, so do you remember that the overall section that we're dealing with here is about nationalism and sectionalism? Do you recall that as we talked about the economic nationalism, the judicial nationalism with these Supreme Court decisions that were so influential? And this was a part of Clay's American system. Well, today we want to move to, as we talk about Monroe's foreign policy, we're going to focus on what we're going to call diplomatic nationalism. Under Monroe, under his presidency, his administration really had an aggressive stance towards expanding the boundaries of our nation and also having America be recognized by European countries as kind of the dominant presence in the Western Hemisphere. Now, John Quincy Adams, who would later become president, and whose dad was the second president, John Adams, John Quincy was the Secretary of State under Monroe, and he really was a major player in the diplomatic nationalism. Now I'm going to talk about different things that happened between 1817 and 1821, so I might not have them in perfect chronological order here, but I'll do my best to keep it somewhat in order. So you can see here, he had nationalist priorities that our nation would be secure and our nation would expand. Nationalism, as we understand it from this time period, because if you keep up with any of the modern news, President Trump mentioned nationalism a couple of months ago, and the media just about lost their minds with that. But when we talk about nationalism from this period, we're talking about a belief, and I believe this is what Trump had in mind, that national interests should be placed ahead of regional concerns and the interests of other countries. And I believe a lot of American citizens agree with that. So let's talk about some of the things that happened, and I want to start here with two treaties that we made with Great Britain, which basically demilitarized the border with Canada. And the first one we want to talk about really was done before Adams was the Secretary of State. The Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817 basically brought about a resolution between the U.S. and Britain, which controlled Canada, because both countries wanted to still have naval rights and fishing rights on the Great Lakes. Those 5 huge bodies of fresh water that are on the border of Canada and the United States. And so that's what the Rush-Bagot Agreement was. And the guy who was the Secretary of State was, I believe his first name is Richard Rush. Yeah, here we go, right here, Rush-Bagot Agreement. He was basically Monroe had him in his cabinet, and just for a brief period of time, he was acting Secretary of State until John Quincy Adams could return to America. So this actually happened under that brief period when he was Secretary of State. And I believe I've got the historical marker picture here of it. What this agreement did was allowed each country to have 4 ships or armed vessels on the Great Lakes simply to police them, and they would not construct any new warships. So the naval presence of both countries greatly diminished on the Great Lakes under this agreement. Only 4 ships each. So that was the Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817. So let me go back up here, and remember there was another treaty with Britain, and this one was done under Adams' leadership, and that is the Convention of 1818. It had several provisions in it. The United States had fishing rights off of parts of Newfoundland, which had been up here. And Labrador coast. I'm not exactly sure where Labrador is. The big component of the Convention of 1818 is that it established a border between the United States and Canada from basically what is now Minnesota, from the most western Great Lake, and all the way to the Rocky Mountains. This is the 49th parallel, and that became the boundary. And then everything west of the Rockies, this yellow section here, which was called the Oregon Territory, that was jointly possessed by the United States and Britain, and both groups had rights to fish in the waters of the Pacific Northwest. So now all of this brown area is United States territory. This white area in the middle is United States territory. This blue area, as well as this white area, including Arizona, California, Nevada, this is a part of Spain. And then this Oregon territory is possessed both by the U.S. and Great Britain. Here are the specifics of that convention of 1818, if you need to take notes. A little bit bigger than the other slide. All right, if anybody needs to go back to that, let me know. Now, Adams also did some negotiations with Spain concerning their territory. Spain also still owned Florida. I forgot to mention that. So Spain, basically the Texas area and the Southwest, as well as Florida. So between 1816, let me find some more of my notes here. Between 1816 and 1818, you had some different developments or situations occurring that involved Spain's territory of Florida. Florida had become basically a haven for runaway slaves from these southern states closest to Florida. Also, the Seminole Indians lived in the Florida area, and John Calhoun, who was the Secretary of War, ordered General Andrew Jackson to lead an army from Tennessee into Florida. And Jackson was somewhat of a rogue, even though he had orders from Washington, he still was down here in the Florida area by himself. And so he took it upon himself to lead his men to assault some Spanish forts. There was a fort at St. Mark. He also destroyed some Seminole villages. Suwannee. There's another fort, Fort Scott. And then eventually, by May of 1818, under Jackson's leadership, they had set up a provisional government for the United States on this very western edge of Florida, which angered the Spanish. So what he also did, along with capturing runaway slaves, killing Seminole Indians, he would also execute British troublemakers, or troublemakers that he felt, or British that he felt were troublemakers. So he was kind of down here on his own, had gone rogue. The Spanish did not like it. And if you haven't done your discussion about, if you haven't finished your discussion about President Trump and who you felt like he was most like, this might be something you could add. But many of the American citizens agreed with Jackson in the way he did things during his military career. But anyway, he kind of forced the hand of Adams or the Monroe administration. And so Adams negotiated the Transcontinental Treaty in 1819 with Spain. It was also called the Adams-Onis Treaty. Yeah, the Adams-Onis Treaty. And this is what it did. It turned over Florida to the United States. And then Spain relinquished any claims that they had to Louisiana. So Florida becomes a part of the United States. The United States now has sole claim to the Louisiana Territory. And then another thing that it did was it established a boundary line, basically going up the western boundary of Louisiana, going across the Red River here. Going up which would be the western edge of our state, then going across here the Arkansas River to the Rocky Mountains, and then up we have another parallel, the 42nd parallel, and then from the place where the 42nd parallel is in the Rocky Mountains all the way to the Pacific coast. This is the boundary between New Spain, that is the territories of Spain and the New World, and the United States. We also relinquished any claims that we had to Texas. So those were the provisions of the Adams-Onis Treaty. And so Florida would that be, as a new territory, would Southerners be happy about that or upset?
They'd be happy.
Yeah, they'd be happy. Another territory that would be a slave territory, slave state. So Florida, we were able to, when I said part of the treaty was we got this from Spain, we paid $5 million for it. So we paid for Florida to get it, just like we did the Louisiana Purchase. All right, any questions on the first few things about this diplomatic nationalism, these treaties with England and with Spain? The here's kind of the timeline of the events. We're going to move now to probably the most well-known and most influential foreign diplomacy doctrine or legislation during the Monroe presidency. We talked about the Missouri Compromise. We're going to move now to the Monroe Doctrine. Here is another map of what it looked like after all these treaties. The North and the East states, the southern states with Florida, Arkansas Territory is open to slavery. This is closed to slavery. The Oregon Country, occupied by both Great Britain and the United States, the Spanish possessions. Here's a nice little cartoon where Monroe is saying, well, Quincy, this should prevent any more pesky British invasions. And he's got the Monroe Doctrine there. And John Quincy Adams, in his prophetic role, says, at least until the Beatles. Those are those four guys who came over in the 60s and they invaded our country with their music. All right, just a little comic relief there. All right, the Monroe Doctrine. You'll need to know this for the test, so just highlight it, star it, circle it, whatever you do in your notes. The Monroe Doctrine is probably the cornerstone of Monroe's foreign policy. You still had European countries that still wanted to colonize, and much of Latin America have been colonized by Spain, but many of those countries were gaining their independence, and we were forming friendships with them. And the Monroe Doctrine just worked to strengthen even more those relationships with countries in Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine had 4 basic points. And this is what Monroe delivered to Congress in 1823. The heart of the doctrine is that Europe is not going to interfere with the Western Hemisphere. North America, South America, Canada. So the four basic points were the U.S. would not interfere in the affairs of European nations. If England were to go to war with Russia, the U.S. would not interfere. That's just something I pulled off the top of my head. The U.S. would recognize and not interfere with countries that already existed in the Americas. So Brazil, Portugal, Mexico, we're not going to interfere with them. The Western Hemisphere was off limits to any more colonization by any foreign power, but especially by the European powers. And then any attempt by a European power to colonize or interfere in the Western Hemisphere, we would interpret that as a hostile act. And we would defend ourselves and our fellow neighbors in the Americas. So here's a little cartoon of the time that shows Uncle Sam, which is us, and the Monroe Doctrine is saying the Western Hemisphere is off limits to you European, especially you European powers, but all other foreign powers. I think a young J.R.R. Tolkien, when he was taking history, was inspired by this to create a character named Gandalf who would say, "You shall not pass." That's what Monroe Doctrine was saying to foreign countries. You shall not pass into the Western Hemisphere and try to colonize it for your own purposes or interfere with any of the countries. And then I was inspired to give you this inspiration that if you don't study, you too shall not pass. Got to study. That's important. So, any questions on the Monroe Doctrine? Have a good rest of your day and a good Wednesday. When we meet back Thursday morning, we will start with the presidency of Andrew Jackson and the error of Jacksonian democracy, the very last 4 pages of chapter 9, and then chapter 10 is what we will cover. So, any questions? We'll see you then. Bye-bye.